In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Now LOTRO was set during the time of Frodo's journey, so that's why we have Lobelia and Lotho standing outside. But we're going to recreate the journey of Bilbo with Thorin Company. Bilbo answered the door to a lot of dwarves and brought them into his pantry, where they proceeded to go through his excellent hospitality, much to Bilbo's annoyance. Later, when Gandalf arrived, they moved into the study, and it was here that Bilbo first began to hear about dragon hordes and gold and revenge. Little did he know he was about to undertake his most important journey of his life, from Eriador to Rivendell. The following morning, when Bilbo got up, he was dismayed at the washing up that was left for him, and Gandalf had told him that he had slept in and was late, and that Thorin and co were waiting for him at the Green Dragon Inn in Bywater. Which is why Bilbo found himself running out of his house without so much as a pocket handkerchief in order to catch up with the rest of the dwarves. There seems to be a plague of fire beings in the Shire at the moment. Now Bilbo must have been a very fast runner, because the distance between Bag End and the Green Dragon Inn is quite considerable, and to run that in 10 minutes is no mean feat. Now, I don't know why it was the Green Dragon Inn they met up with Bilbo, because the Ivy Bush is just across the bridge from Hobbiton. Though I suppose it's got to do with the story, the Green Dragon evoking images of Smaug, rather than a bush as being a starting point for an epic journey. Eventually he met up with the dwarves, and mounting on the ponies, they set off into the east towards Erebor. You'll see in the sky a rainbow, which is a rare sight indeed in LOTRO. Originally, when it came out, it was part of the Eregion region, but it actually caused some sort of conflicts or issues with code, and they took it away, and it has never been seen again since. But it's interesting now to see it placed in the Shire. Tolkien writes, "At first they had passed through WildLands, a wide respectable country inhabited by decent folk with good roads, an inn or two, and now and then a dwarf or a farmer ambling by on business." Now, if you've ever read Karen Wynne Fostant's the Atlas of Middle-earth, she does a comparison between how long it took Bilbo with Thorin and Company to journey from Bag End to Rivendell on ponies, and compared that to Frodo and the Company when they were basically on foot. And actually Frodo made a better time. It seemed to be that the dwarves and Bilbo took their time in moving along their journey. So I'm not sure if Tolkien was aware of the distances then or paid too much attention to the distances then. But anyway, in the game, it's quite a long distance. I like the way the developers put doors on the last bridge exiting the Shire as a way of saying that they would close the borders, which was the job of the Bounders, hobbits who were supposed to turn back the big folk from trespassing onto their land. So we've now left the Shire and are heading along the road towards Bree, passing by the old forest, which Bilbo never actually went into, Frodo only going into it to escape from the Nazgul who were in pursuit. And in the book that Tolkien wrote, this length of journey between Bag End and the Trollshaws is only about 2 pages. So it was a very uneventful journey for them to take. Now we're just passing a place called Adzo's Camp, which lies to the entrance of the Barrow Downs. A place that Bilbo never went into, but of course Frodo went through it as he exited from the old forest. And as we turn around the road here, you can just see the edge of the Barrow Downs on the right of the screen. It was an area in Lord of the Rings Online that I didn't really like to go into at night time. I preferred to leave most of the quests that I needed to do in there for the daytime. And this gives credit to the developers who actually populated it with more creatures at nighttime, like wights and skeletons, than it did during the daytime, so it felt that there was a difference depending on the time of day. Surprisingly, no mention was made of Bree, which is a stop that you think Thorin Company would have taken, especially with the inns and the chance to sleep under a roof for a night. However, we are going to circumvent Bree, and we're going to go around the southeast road rather than going straight through it. Maybe Thorin didn't want any of his business known by the menfolk. A company of dwarves with a hobbit would have raised some suspicion, no doubt, as to what they were up to. Now, somewhere to the right of this area, you will eventually come to the Bree housing lands, where players can have their own different types of housing to keep mementos in from their adventures within the game. It never made sense to me why they put it this far down, and why they didn't just link it into some of the properties within Bree, which would have made it more of a central hub when you see people running throughout the town on their way to various adventures. It would have been so much easier to just nip into your house, leave stuff off, or even to meet or organize events there, rather than having to port or map down to a different area altogether. Just south of Bree, we have the Midgewater Marshes, and I remember this being as one of my biggest disappointments in Lord of the Rings Online. It somehow just didn't feel like it lived up to the expectations of how it was portrayed in the books. Yeah, there were some good quests running around it, but the midges, I don't know, it just didn't seem to fulfill that sort of expectation. Now we're passing an interesting place called the Forsaken Inn, which originally never featured in Tolkien's retelling of the journey. It was only added later on a map called The Last Inn, and a mention in the text that the dwarves saw it in disrepair, which emphasized the whole meaning and theme of the Lowlands, which was a place of desolation. Now again, Tolkien writes about the next part of this journey. Then they came to lands where people spoke strangely, and sang songs Bilbo had never heard before. Now they had gone on far into the lone lands, where there were no people left, no inns, and the roads grew steadily worse. Not far ahead were dreary hills, rising higher and higher, dark with trees. On some of them were old castles with an evil look, as if they had been built by wicked people. Everything seemed gloomy, for the weather that day had taken a nasty turn. Mostly it had been as good as May can be, even in merry tales. But now it was cold and wet. In the lone lands, they had been obliged to camp when they could, but at least it had been dry. The interesting thing about the Lone Lands in Lord of the Rings Online is the region of Agamor, with the Red Pass, and where the instance Darth Garwin is. Now, when I originally started playing LOTRO, I found the community to be very helpful, people wanting to assist you in your quest, especially if you came up against some tough NPCs to tackle. But in this region alone, I don't know what it was, but it seemed to be that it changed the players. No one wanted to help. People rushed to steal whatever you were trying to accomplish, whether it was to kill something or to gather something. And I don't know whether it was just the red sky that hung over or not, but it did seem to change people's behavior, and you never got anybody in that region to help out. Though the Lone Lands do have fond memories, especially of the very first LOTRO video that I ever made, which was a recruitment video for our kin, and most of it was shot around the Lone Lands. In fact, the most iconic scene within the video was when the horses came riding over the lip of the ridge to the tune of the Riders of Rohan from the movie. And I remember having to do this purely just by typing in the chat and then turning off all of the user interface to try and start the recorder. All this without voice control, without VoIP or in-game voice or any Discord server or TeamSpeak. And so you can just imagine how long it took just to shoot that simple scene. Now we can see ahead of us the last bridge, and this marks the boundary between the Lone Lands and the Trollshaws. When you look at the map of the Lone Lands, it doesn't seem that big, but actually riding through it, it's quite a distance that is disproportionate to the other maps from different areas in the game of the same size. They tend to be gone through a lot quicker than the Lone Lands does. So I'm not sure whether in the early days of the developers they had envisaged a larger playing area, or whether they just decided for some reason to emphasize the loneliness of those lands in making that area big. But nevertheless, it's still quite a long ride to get through. We're approaching now a spot in the story which is where I first actually ever heard about The Hobbit or Tolkien. And it was during the summer when I was a young child that the BBC had a series called Jackanory, which was actors, famous celebrities, retelling storybooks for children on camera. And they were doing an episode of The Hobbit, and this was the part of the story that they were doing. Because all I can remember is this sense of a group of people who were in a wood suddenly seeing a light and sending somebody on their own to go and check that light out. And I never really watched the rest of the series or had a desire to go out and buy The Hobbit or get into Tolkien then. It was much later in years that I got into Middle-earth. But I still remember that episode. And it's one of the hardest things to track down today is that old Jackanory TV series of The Hobbit. Over the years of developing content for the game, it's been known that the developers gave quite considerable thought to where they place things depending on the lore of the books. But this is one thing that I don't understand, where they got the sense of distance for this part, because according to the book, the dwarves camped in a clump of trees not far off the road that they were on. And after one of the ponies had bolted, one of the dwarves calls out, "There's a light over there." Now, so it's within seeing distance, and this seems to be quite a long way away from the road to where Bilbo actually discovers the three trolls who are roasting mutton. So after the sun rose and turned the trolls to stone, Gandalf informed the dwarves that there's always nearly a troll horde nearby somewhere, so off they set to discover where that could be. And this was the first compensation that Bilbo received on his services as a burglar. For in that horde, not only were the swords Glamdrain for Gandalf, Orcust for Thorin, and Steen for Bilbo, but there were several large chests of silver and gold that Bilbo had to bury nearby for collection on his return home. Sadly, it's not possible to get inside the troll horde and have a look around. I can't remember whether the players ever did get in to see that, whether it was part of some instance that Lord of the Rings Online had as related to some story arc or not. However, once the company finished with the troll horde, they regained their ponies and headed off towards Rivendell. now we're coming to chapter 3 in the Hobbit story, and Tolkien writes, "They did not sing or tell stories that day, even though the weather improved, nor the next day, nor the day after. They had begun to feel that danger was not far away on either side. They camped under the stars, and their horses had more to eat than they had. For there was plenty of grass, but there was not much in their bags, even with what they had got from the trolls. One morning, they forded a river at a wide, shallow place, full of the noise of stones and foam. The far bank was steep and slippery. When they got to the top of it, leading their ponies, they saw that the great mountains had marched down very near to them. Already they seemed only a day's easy journey from the feet of the nearest. Dark and drear it looked, though there were patches of sunlight on its brown sides, and behind its shoulders the tips of snow peaks gleamed. "Is that the mountain?" asked Bilbo in a solemn voice. We're coming up now to a place in the game called the Gates of Imladris, which were the gates towards the Valley of Rivendell. Now, this for me is one of the most favourite memories I have of the game, because to get to Rivendell, I think at that time it was level 35 you had to be, so you couldn't go right to it. You had to spend a lot of time questing around the troll shaws, fighting in the Lone Lands. And to get to Rivendell, you had to first of all get there by yourself. You couldn't use one of the stable masters within Middle-earth to get there quickly. So the ride towards that valley was fraught with danger. A lot of beasts, bears, boars, flies attacking you. But I remember when I finally got to the level where I could ride through and come into those gates, and then the developers did something fantastic. They actually thought about the view that you would get as you ride down that valley. So they had you twist and turn a bit as you go down the road, and then all of a sudden you take another turn to the right, and there stands the last homely house, the iconic home of Elrond half-elven. Then riding down, you come to another fork. The left fork takes you to the stables of Rivendell. The right fork takes you straight to the house. Of course, we're heading straight towards the house. over certain bridges, which, depending on whether I was playing it on a laptop with good connection or not, sometimes fell off and into the river. It was quite a challenge to get out of that river and back up the banks again. But eventually we arrived at the last opening house. So in Rivendell, or as the house is called, Imladris, Bilbo finally gets to meet Elrond half-elven. And this, apart from the elves in the valley who were singing silly songs as he rode down, is his real first contact with elven kind. In the game, Elrond was a central quest giver for most of the Rivendell and Misty Mountains areas. And even later, when further expansions came out, he was still central to the story of Middle-earth. And now we head across from Elrond's library to have a look at some of the rooms where the guests stayed. Now, these rooms were never in the original release of Shadows of Angmar. They were added later. I don't know what purpose they served other than just eye candy, or maybe to answer criticism that Imladris was basically empty and didn't have any other purpose. Originally, there were only 3 rooms: Elrond's library, which we saw, and the back porch, which is where Elrond looked at Thror's map and noticed that there may be moon letters on it, letters that can only be read by the light of the same moon as on the day they were written. And it's here that Thorin first learns of the secret west door. And then the final room that was only in the original design of Imladris when the game released was, of course, the Hall of Fire, where many people sat, told stories, sang songs, and of course where Frodo met Bilbo many years later. This place was actually used by a lot of different kins to hold meetings between other kins to form alliances. And of course, there we have our protagonist of the story, Mr. Bilbo Baggins himself. Now, once all their business was finished in Rivendell, of course, the dwarves and Gandalf and Bilbo, saddled with new ponies, all headed off early the next morning. Now, as we leave the Rivendell Valley and head up into the mountains, one of the things about this that we start to notice is that so far in the game we've just traversed across a lot of lands that have lush green trees and grass and a bit of stone, but we've never seen any different climate. And coming out of Rivendell, now suddenly we start to come into a snow-capped landscape. And the further we move up that pass, the less green trees and grass we see, and the more snow we begin to experience. So it gives you a great sense that you're heading up into very tall mountains, particularly the Misty Mountains, which is why they were given their name. According to Tolkien, there were many paths that led up into those mountains and many passes over them. But most of the paths were cheats and deceptions and led nowhere or to bad ends. And most of the passes were infested by evil things and dreadful dangers. The dwarves and the hobbit, helped by the wise advice of Elrond and the knowledge and memory of Gandalf, took the right road to the right pass. So there's a number of different ways on this map that you can get to the right pass, which is the high pass where we are heading to now. But also in this area of the map there are other passes that do lead to evil ends. Heligrod was the first big raid in the game for level 50, where you had to team up with at least 12 other players to try and have any success at completing that mission. And that's in the north of this map. In the southern part of this map you will begin to see some giants, not the storm giants or the big stone giants that were talked about in The Hobbit, but still nevertheless giants. You can go down into the south part of this map and you'll see the giant halls. So there's quite a lot to adventure around in this area. And of course it was while they were climbing up and up and up into the mountains is where Bilbo started to first really miss his home and look to the west in sadness and wish that he was back safe in his little warm, comfortable hobbit hole. So this was, as Tolkien says, the hard path and the dangerous path, a crooked way and a lonely and a lawn. And here we begin to see some of different weather effects that are in the game. So far in most parts of the Shire and the Lone Lands, there are times where it might rain, you might see a thunderstorm. But here in the High Pass, we begin to see the first little flurries of snow that tell us that we're getting higher and higher up into these mountain peaks. Now they seem to have tamed the weather down a bit in this pass. I certainly remember coming along here with it being a lot more of a storm, hard to see, and a danger at times of falling off this cliff edge down into goblin infested camps. Very frustrating, but still it added to the effect of it. So I think they've toned that down, made it a lot clearer so you can see what you're riding through, which I think takes away from the atmosphere of the game. Now within this area nearby, there are two entrances to bring you into Goblin Town. One is called, I think, the back door or the side door, but we are going to go to the one that was mentioned in the book, which is the Black Crack, and this is the cave that the dwarves and Gandalf and Bilbo sheltered in because of a large storm, in which they were surprised by hordes of goblins who took them below. Clap, snap, the black crack, grip, grab, pinch, nab, and down, down the goblin town you go, my lad. Clash, crash, crush, smash, hammer and tauns, knocker and guns, pound, pound for underground, ho ho, my lad. Swish, smack, whip, crack, butter and beat, yammer and bleat. Work, work, nor dare to shirk, while goblins quaff and goblins laugh, round and round for underground, below, my lad. It sounded truly terrifying. The walls echoed to the clap, snap, and the crush, smash, and to the ugly laughter of their ho-ho, my lad. The general meaning of the song was only too plain, for now the goblins took out whips and whipped them with a swish smack and set them running as fast as they could in front of them, and more than one of the dwarves were already yammering and bleeding like anything. Goblin Town was one of the first multi-level dungeons that occurred in LOTRO. It's a great place where, without a map, it was very difficult to remember where you had been. So many twists and turns, passages, and all the time goblins were out to get you, especially those nasty, sneaky ones that were near invisible. So as Bilbo and the dwarves were brought further down and down, deeper into Goblin Town, they eventually came to the throne of the Goblin King. Now originally you could go down here at a higher level and revisit the throne room, but they've changed it now into an instance, so it's scaled to your level, which is why I tried to go through and visit the great goblin himself. course, the Great Goblin was having none of Thorin's explanations as to why the dwarves were there, and if it wasn't for the timely intervention of Gandalf, who caused confusion, the dwarves would have ended up in a worse fate. In all the confusion, Bilbo got separated from the dwarves, and on his own found himself exploring strange and lonely passages, where no goblin seemed to go. So as you can see on the wall, the goblins during the time of Frodo have painted pictures recreating their adventures or their encounters with the dwarves. And they even warn about a strange creature that was snatching away many of their young. Deep down here by the dark water lived old Gollum, a small slimy creature. I don't know where he came from, nor who or what he was. He was Gollum, as dark as darkness, except for two big round pale eyes in his thin face. He had a little boat, and he rowed about quite quietly on the lake. Now, even though Bilbo didn't go out to the lake, we'll go out and take a look at Gollum's abode. And as you can see, it's quite frugal, with only a little bit of stick and cloth to show any sign of a home. Now, having beaten Gollum at the riddle game, Bilbo escaped from the lake underground and ran quickly out towards the exit of Goblin Town. He was still separated from the dwarves, but he heard voices nearby, and very soon he regained Thorin Company. Although he kept the matter of the ring a closely guarded secret. Now, Gandalf, fearing pursuit, urged the dwarves to get as far from the back door as possible. And so the company moved throughout Rivendell. After what seemed ages further, they came suddenly to an opening where no trees grew. The moon was up and was shining into the clearing. Somehow it struck all of them as not at all a nice place, although there was nothing wrong to see. All of a sudden, they heard a howl away downhill, a long, shuddering howl. It was answered by another away to the right.
and a good deal near to them, then by another, not far away to the left. It was wolves howling at the moon, wolves gathering together. Now, as they had ended up in the warg clearing, and there was no hope of escape except Gandalf had told them all to get up into the trees, but when the goblins came along they were going to start to set fire to them. But then, with the timely intervention of the eagles, they were whisked away to the eagle's eyrie, out of danger and free from harm. The next morning, Bilbo woke up with the early sun in his eyes. He jumped up to look at the time and to go and put his kettle on, and found he was not home at all. So he sat down and wished in vain for a wash and a brush. He did not get either, nor tea, nor toast, nor bacon for his breakfast, only cold mutton and rabbit. And after that, he had to get ready for a fresh start. So eventually the eagles brought Thorin Company to the Corrock, and that's where they sat them down for the next stage of their journey. They did a good job of recreating this in-game, even though the Corrock wasn't really used for many quests. Nevertheless, I think the developers were looking more to give people places where they could go and revisit locations that they had read about in the book. Now this area is the latest update as of July 2019, and they've done quite a good job of filling out quests within the area. It's made it quite interesting, although I think Radagast's role has been diminished somewhat. They could have done a lot more around Roscoeville, but nevertheless, still it was very enjoyable to quest throughout this bit of the Anduin. So Gandalf was bringing the dwarves to Beorn, whom he knew from before, and they moved through various bee pastures, and as the book says, after a while they came to a belt of tall and very ancient oaks, and beyond them to a high thorn hedge through which you could neither see nor scramble. And this is the case with the entrance to the Beorning house, as they call it in the game. There's only one entrance in, one exit out, and they're both the same. So Gandalf did a good job of introducing the dwarves to Beorn one at a time through his careful use of wordplay and storytelling, and eventually the dwarves enjoyed the hospitality of Beorn's hall. So the next few days after a rest, they got new ponies from Beorn and headed off towards the east. Gandalf was bringing them to the forest gate, at which point he told the dwarves that they need to send the ponies back, and he's not going to go with them. He's going to return the ponies himself because he had business elsewhere, which we know from later books as dealing with the necromancer in the south of Mirkwood. They walked in single file. The entrance to the path was like a sort of arch leading into a gloomy tunnel made by two great trees that leant together, too old and strangled with ivy and hung with lichen to bear more than a few blackened leaves. The path itself was narrow and wound in and out among the trunks. Soon the light at the gate was like a little bright hole far behind, and the quiet was so deep that their feet seemed to thump along while all the trees leaned over them and listened. And again, the developers did a great job of recreating Mirkwood with little shafts of light piercing through here and there. But mostly it was a very dark place to move around and quite easily to get lost in if you didn't have the map to go by. The only bad thing about this area in the game is that there aren't that many stable masters in the area, so you can quickly go from one part to another. Most of it you have to ride through yourself. And it's populated a lot with all manners of bears, wolves, wood trolls and sprites to impede your progress. So we're following along the old forest road, which is basically going to take us through pretty quickly. But the dwarves stumbled through the forest, having lost the road, going round in circles, not sure which way they were progressing. And of course they were encumbered with Bombur, who fell into the enchanted river and went into a deep sleep. Now while that meant they had to carry a heavy weight with them, the benefit of it was that he was sleeping, and therefore Bombur, being Bombur, didn't eat as much of the provisions as would have been kept. So therefore I think the company lasted a little bit longer. So it says in the book it was about 4 days from the enchanted stream when they came to a part where most of the trees were beeches, and this is where they decided to try and get bearings on where they were. Now the area that's in the game isn't 4 days away, of course, but it's quite close by to where the river is. Somebody had to climb a tree, and of course Bilbo knew that somebody meant him, so up he went. And when he poked his head above the branches, he saw a plethora of butterflies flying above the forest roof. These are described as being dark, velvety black without any markings, and known as the Black Emperors. So of course he couldn't really make out any landmarks. He didn't see Erebor or anything like that. He just saw that the forest went on forever and ever, and this didn't please the dwarves too much when he climbed back down. So it was round about this point that they had started to see glimpses of the elves making merry in the forest at night, and hungry for food and for company and to get out of this gloom, they stumbled wildly through the darkness to each of the festivities. But elves being elves, once they set foot within the circle, the elves turned the lights out and disappeared very quickly. And it was through this way that the dwarves eventually stumbled upon spiders and were caught by the Mirkwood spiders. Bilbo, having his magic ring, was able to evade capture, and it was he who'd finally rescued Thorin Company from the clutches of the evil spiders by drawing them away from the dwarves and freeing them from the cocoons that they were trapped in. In a great cave some miles within the edge of Mirkwood on its eastern side, there lived at this time their greatest king. Before his huge doors of stone, a river ran out of the heights of the forest and flowed on and out into the marshes at the feet of the high wooded lands. This great cave, from which countless smaller ones opened out on every side, wound far underground, and had many passages and wide halls. But it was lighter and more wholesome than any goblin dwelling, and neither so deep nor so dangerous. In fact, the subjects of the king mostly lived and hunted in the open woods, and had houses or huts on the ground and in the branches. The beeches were their favourite trees, the king's cave was his palace, and the strong place of his treasure, and the fortress of his people against their enemies. So I don't think it ever said in the book the name of the Elven King's halls. They were always referred to that in the game that's called Felagroth. And this is where the Elven King questioned Thorin and his company about what they were doing in the forest. And dwarves being dwarves, answering back in a none too polite way, found themselves being tossed into the sails to cool off until they learned better manners, as the Elven King put it. So these areas hadn't been used much in the game regarding quests, but it's nice that they put them in again for aesthetic purposes, that you could actually go and look at places that were mentioned in The Hobbit, even though they're not particularly relevant to the time of the game, which is set in Frodo's time in the War of the Ring. In particular, this region of Middle-earth is actually post-War of the Ring. We didn't get to explore this part until after the Black Tower was destroyed and the Black Gate fell. So these quests are mostly dealing with post-Fall of Sauron. Eventually, after a week or two of this sneaking sort of life by watching and following the guards and taking what chances he could, he managed to find out where each dwarf was kept. He found all their 12 cells in different parts of the palace, and after a time he got to know his way about very well. Now, in the book, this is the longest time that Bilbo spent with the ring on, because he was afraid to take it off in fear of being captured. And he went about day to day feeling very miserable, liking himself to a burglar who had to keep on burgling the same house every day. But eventually, in his discovery of the Elven King's halls, he came up with a plan in which to free the dwarves and escape from the underground fortress. And this was through use of the barrels that the elves had stored in the cellar from all of their feasting and merrymaking, which they put through a trapdoor that floated down the river to the lake men, who refilled them, I think it was with Dorwinian wine, which is in the east, and then sent them back up the river again. So it was a bit of a trade going on here, and Bilbo came up with the idea to put the dwarves in the barrels and have them all cast out. And so, stealing the key from the warden, Bilbo, having rescued the dwarves, brings them to the cellars, puts them inside, and waits for them to be thrown down the trapdoor. Going through the water gate and out into the WildLands. He himself, of course, couldn't be put into a barrel and the lid put on, so just putting on his ring, he sits atop an empty apple barrel, and he too is cast out. And here we are on the shores of the Anduin, where the barrels have come down the river, gathered by the lake men, tied together, and then put into like a raft and punted down the river for refilling. Now, even though the barrels felt heavy, according to one of the raft men, they still proceeded with moving down the river because they said they hadn't got time. So there must have been a very strict turnaround on the Elven King's order for the wine. Which just goes to show us that they do like their wine, the elves. Now on the right hand side we see some elven structures, and again you just bear in mind that this is set in not the time of the Hobbit, that it's actually post destruction of the ring. So since the time of the Hobbit, and now the elves probably established a more permanent haven where the barrels were then sent on to Lake Town. Now, according to the book, it says, the day grew lighter and warmer as they floated along. After a while, the river rounded a deep shoulder of land that came down upon their left. Under its rocky feet, like an island cliff, the deepest stream had flowed, lapping and bubbling. Suddenly the cliff fell away, the shores sank, and the trees ended. Then Bilbo saw a sight. The lands opened wide about him, filled with the waters of the river, which broke up and wandered in 100 winding courses, or halted in marshes and pools dotted with isles on every side. But still the strong water flowed on steadily through the mist, and far away, its dark head in a torn cloud, there loomed the mountain. So just a nice leisurely cruise down the river. And because just around the bend would be the old Escarf that Smaug had destroyed, we're going to make a jump cut to the new Lake Town. So just to show you what it would be like for Bilbo had he been going down this river and then suddenly making a turn around the bend and the sight that he would have seen. So that was probably the sight he saw, like going down the river, which we never got to see. We can see it here just behind Lake Town, which would have been a bigger sight, I think, that would have caught his eye as he rounded the bend. Being a hobbit and living in a hole, seeing people living on water would be quite a spectacle for him to witness. So when the dwarves finally landed in Lake Town, they announced themselves as who they were, causing great uproar amongst the citizens and concern amongst the master of the town. I thought played excellently by Stephen Fry in the movie, quite true to the characterization that he was depicted in the book. Anyway, the time came for the dwarves to leave Lake Town and to head towards the mountain and to seize the gold that they promised. The king beneath the mountains, the king of carven stone, the lord of silver fountains, shall come into his own. So having survived trolls, giants, goblins, wolves, and even Beorn, the dwarves are getting closer to their hometown. Now moving northwards up the lake, they will soon alight on the shore and head towards their ancient home, Erebor. Now in The Hobbit, this was known as the Desolation of Smaug, because it was a land that didn't have birds flying around or any animals or beasts. You could imagine it as like a withered heath. But now, many years later, of course, as we are visiting it during the Third Age, roughly I think 3020 the year would be, it's gone back to the originality of its beauty. So according to the book, it took them 2 days to row up the Long Lake into the river running that came down from the mountain. Here we can see, as we're getting closer, the majesticness of Erebor really standing out from the background scenery. So we're just passing by Dale. The town was rebuilt on its old foundations. And the dwarves were making towards a place called Raven Hill, so they could spy out the west side of the mountain. Tolkien writes, "It was a weary journey and a quiet and stealthy one. There was no laughter or song or sound of harps, and the pride and hopes which had stirred in their hearts at the singing of old songs by the lake died away to a plodding gloom. They knew that they were drawing near to the end of their journey, and that it might be a very horrible end. The land about them grew bleak and barren, though once, as Thorin had told them, it had been green and fair. There was little grass, and before long there was neither bush nor tree, and only bracken and blackened stumps to speak of one's lawn vanished. They were come to the desolation of the dragon, and they were come at the waning of the year." So eventually we reached Raven Hill, which seemed to be like a postal service or a messenger service for the dwarves between Erebor, Dane in the Iron Hills, who was a distant cousin, Lake Town, and any other, maybe even Elfkeen Halls. It's all serviced by the ravens of Erebor. So the dwarves, having gone originally to the front gate and found that they can't actually enter through that way, decided to try and find where this secret door is that had been talked about on Thror's map, which he found out about from Elrond. If you remember, he looked at the moon ladders and gave him a clue as to the location of the secret door. So the final stage for Bilbo is arising, even though afterwards there was the whole Battle of Five Armies and the death of Thorin and stuff like that. We're not going to cover it in this video. Those would have been handled in story instances. But Bilbo's job was basically to get them to the west door and inside. Here we now start to ascend the mountain. As you can see, there's no trees, no grass, just barren rock as he goes higher and higher looking for that secret entrance. So of course, being set in a time after Thorin Company had disposed of Smaug, the actual secret door is marked by a little tomb or statue. And of course, according to the map, they had to wait until dusk, stand by the grey stone, and with the fading light of Beorn's day, the sun will shine upon the keyhole. So we're not going to wait for the whole sunset, just going to speed time up a little bit here, just to show you the effects of the sun setting. Quickly, Bilbo explained. They all fell silent. The hobbit standing by the grey stone and the dwarves with wagging beards watched impatiently. The sun sank lower and lower, and their hopes fell. It sank into a belt of reddened cloud and disappeared. The dwarves groaned, but still Bilbo stood almost without moving. The little moon was dipping to the horizon. Evening was coming on. Then suddenly, when their hope was lowest, a red ray of the sun escaped like a finger through a rent in the cloud. A gleam of light came straight through the opening into the bay and fell on the smooth rock face. The old thrush, who had been watching from a high perch with beady eyes and head cocked on one side, gave a sudden trill, and there was a loud crack. A flake of rock split from the wall and fell. A hole suddenly appeared about 3 feet from the ground. Now, of course, from here on in, Bilbo goes into the cave, discovers Smaug, the destruction of Lake Town follows, the Battle of Five Armies. We won't be covering all that. We are just bringing Bilbo to the side door to recreate his most epic adventure. Because after all, at this time in the game, there's nothing to fear from any dragon. Or is there? And there you have it, guys. That's the journey of Bilbo Baggins from Bag End to the west side of Erebor. Thanks for watching.